It took me years to understand that my greatest enemy was never the difficulty. It was my own haste. And when I discovered Shuhari, everything changed. Today, I'm going to show you how I learned to master skills that previously seemed impossible. And it's not just theory. It's the same method used by geishas, artists, and Japanese masters for centuries. Simple, profound, and brutally efficient. Stay with me until the end, because a single sentence from Mineko can change the way you learn forever. I had to start as an empty trainee. In the beginning, I realized that there's no point in wanting to be a master if I don't even accept being a learner. This simple phrase destroyed years of misplaced ego that kept me trapped in mediocrity disguised as pride. I had this terrible habit of starting something new, already wanting to be good immediately, already expecting results, already comparing myself to people who had been practicing for years. When I started studying Shuhari, the Japanese path of deep learning used by geishas and martial arts masters, I understood that my biggest barrier wasn't a lack of talent or time. It was my refusal to accept the essential phase of being a complete beginner. I skipped the shu phase, where you are the empty cup that needs to be filled, and tried to go straight to advanced stages, and then got frustrated when it didn't work. It was like trying to build the second floor of a house without having built the first. Structurally impossible, but my ego insisted on trying. I was ashamed of being a beginner, ashamed of asking basic questions, ashamed of not understanding immediately, ashamed of needing help. This shame cost me years of potential progress because I pretended to know when I didn't, pretended to understand when I was confused, pretended to be competent when I was clearly a novice. And worse, I gave up on things early on because if I wasn't naturally good at them in the first attempts, I assumed it wasn't for me or that I didn't have the talent. But talent isn't magic. It's the result of going through the humiliating phase of being terrible at something and continuing anyway. Geishas spent years in the shu phase, years literally copying their master's movement by movement, note by note, gesture by gesture, without questioning, without trying to add their personal touch, just absorbing like empty sponges. And I was trying to skip this essential phase because my ego couldn't bear the vulnerability of being a learner. When I allow myself to be taught, I let go of the anxiety of looking good and finally begin to truly learn. This shift in perspective was revolutionary. Instead of entering a class or learning situation with the pressure of already appearing competent, I began to enter with the freedom to be visibly incompetent. I don't know ceased to be a shameful phrase and became an opening statement. Can you teach me again? Ceased to be an admission of failure and became a commitment to true mastery. I stopped wasting energy performing knowledge I didn't have and began to use all that energy for genuine absorption. And something magical happened. I began to learn faster than ever because I was no longer torn between actually learning and appearing to already know. All my attention was finally available for learning instead of being wasted on ego maintenance. The shu phase is about emptying the cup that's already full of opinions, assumptions, and ego. It's about saying, I know nothing about this, and I'm ready to be molded. Maikos, geisha apprentices, spent their first years literally following their mistresses like shadows, imitating every detail without adding anything of their own. And this wasn't suppression of individuality. It was building a solid foundation upon which their unique individuality would eventually flourish. But without that foundation, without that phase of pure imitation, without that humility to accept being an apprentice, you remain forever floating in mediocrity, always superficial, never profound, always thinking you know, but never truly knowing. I finally understood that mastery begins with the courage to be publicly, uncomfortably, a complete beginner. Repetition is my first teacher. I understood that repetition is not failure. Repetition is shaping my spirit. For years, I ran from repetition as if it were my enemy. I thought that if I needed to do something more than once to learn it, it meant I was stupid, slow, incapable. My modern mind, addicted to instant gratification, violently rejected the idea of practicing the same thing repeatedly. I wanted constant novelty, new stimulus, visible progress every second. When I began to study how geishas learned their arts, I was shocked. They practiced the same fan movement thousands of times, the same musical note for weeks, the same tea ceremony, until each gesture was as natural as breathing. It wasn't punishment or a lack of creativity from their masters. It was ancient wisdom about how true knowledge integrates with the body and spirit. Repetition was not an obstacle to mastery. It was the only path to it. Each repetition I consciously performed was like a chisel sculpting marble, removing a tiny fragment of imperfection, revealing the true form hidden within. But I had treated repetition as an enemy because I didn't see immediate dramatic changes. I would practice something 3-4 times and already get impatient. Why am I not good at this yet? What I didn't understand is that the first 1,000 repetitions are building invisible foundations, creating neural pathways, training muscle memory, integrating knowledge in a way that transcends the conscious. The 10th time you do something, it's still clumsy. The 100th time, it already has some fluidity. The 1,000th time is when the magic begins, when your body knows without your mind needing to direct each movement. But I gave up on the 10th repetition, never getting close to the transformation that happens when you truly commit to repeated practice. Every pointless repetition I avoid is a talent I kill before it's born. This truth struck me like a spear when I finally understood the real cost of my impatience. How many skills could I have mastered if I had persisted through uncomfortable and seemingly useless repetitions? How many potential talents did I murder in the cradle because I judged my first clumsy attempts as evidence that it wasn't for me? Every time I thought, this is boring, I've done this several times and I'm still not good, I was literally in the process of killing an emerging talent. Because talent isn't a magical gift that falls from the sky. It's the accumulated result of thousands of repetitions that most people don't have the patience to complete. The person you admire and call talented probably did 10,000 repetitions that you didn't see. Not glamorous, not impressive, just pure and silent dedication. The Minekos practiced their dance steps every morning before sunrise, the same steps for years. Not because they were slow or incapable, but because they understood that repetition is like water shaping stone. It doesn't work by force, it works by consistency. Water hitting a stone once does nothing. But water hitting the same spot thousands of times eventually creates caves, carves canyons, transforms the landscape completely. I had been the kind of person who gave up after throwing water on a stone once, complaining that nothing changed. The Geishas taught me that there is no shortcut through repetition. You can only decide whether you will do the necessary repetitions or spend your life being mediocre at many things, but a master at none. Mastery is the exclusive territory of those willing to make it seem easy by doing the difficult thing 1,000 times in particular. So I began to embrace repetition not as punishment, but as an honor. Each time I practiced something new, even when it seemed identical to the previous attempt, I was actually making invisible micro-adjustments that would accumulate into visible transformation eventually. I stopped asking, how many times until I'm good, and began to simply repeat, without counting, without judging, without obsessively timing my progress. And paradoxically, when I stopped resisting repetition and began surrendering to it, my progress accelerated dramatically, because I was no longer spending half my energy fighting the process itself. I was finally cooperating with the only way deep learning happens, through the same action done consciously, repeatedly, until the extraordinary emerges from the ordinary through sheer accumulation of dedicated effort. Breaking the first circle. When the basics entered my body, I felt a freedom I had never experienced before. It was a specific moment I will never forget. I was practicing something I had repeated hundreds of times in the Shu phase, and suddenly, my body simply knew what to do without my mind needing to direct each movement. My hands moved with natural fluidity, my breathing was perfectly synchronized, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about the steps, I was the steps. Geishas call this the moment when the technique enters the bones, when you no longer need to mentally consult the instructions because your body has absorbed the knowledge so deeply that it has become instinctive. And it was in this moment of complete embodiment of the basics that something unexpected happened. I no longer felt bound by the rules, I felt liberated by them. The solid foundations I had built through tireless repetition were now the firm ground on which I could finally begin to dance. This is the transition from the Shu phase to the Ha phase, when you've mastered the basics so well that you can begin to question, adapt, and experiment. But here's the crucial point. You can't jump to Ha without completing Shu. I had. tried this in the past, attempting to add my personal touch before mastering the fundamentals, and the result was always a mess disguised as creativity. It was like trying to improvise on the piano without knowing how to play scales. You make noise, not music. But now, having humbly passed through the Shu phase, having done the repetitions my ego rejected, having built a solid foundation through faithful imitation, I finally had the necessary basis to begin breaking the initial circle. And breaking didn't mean abandoning everything I'd learned. It meant building upon it, expanding from it, questioning within the context of deep understanding. I don't evolve when I try to do everything differently. I evolve when I finally understand the why. In the Ha phase, for the first time I began to question, not out of superficial rebellion or impatience, but out of genuine curiosity grounded in experience. I was no longer rejecting teachings because they were difficult or because my ego wanted shortcuts. I was exploring the principles behind the techniques, understanding the logic that underpinned each rule, comprehending the profound purpose of each practice. And this understanding of the why transformed everything. Suddenly, the rules were no longer arbitrary prisons imposed by authorities. They were wisdom distilled from generations, each rule existing for a specific reason that I could now clearly see. And when you truly understand why a rule exists, you can then begin to discern when breaking it would serve a greater purpose. Geishas in the Ha stage began to adapt the teachings to their own bodies, their own voices, their own unique spirits. A dance taught identically to 10 apprentices began to seem slightly different in each one because they were in the stage of personal integration, not abandoning the technique, but allowing it to be filtered through their individuality. But this personalization only worked because the foundation was flawless. They could add their nuances because they mastered the pattern. They could intentionally break rules because they deeply understood what each rule was trying to achieve. I finally understood that true creativity doesn't come from ignoring structure. It comes from understanding structure so deeply that you can consciously transcend it. Ha is not a rejection of Shu. It is a graduation from Shu. I began applying this principle to everything I was learning. First, total humility to copy exactly as taught, repeating until exhaustion without adding anything of my own. Then, when the basics were so integrated that they became second nature, the phase of conscious experimentation began. What if I do it this way? Why can't I try it this way? What is the central principle that I need to preserve even when adapting the form? And I discovered that real evolution doesn't happen when you try to be different for the sake of being different, when you reject teachings out of arrogance or impatience. It happens when you have absorbed the teachings so completely that they become a starting point instead of a final destination, when you honor the tradition while contributing your unique voice to it. Ha is the bridge between being an obedient learner and eventually becoming a creative master. But you cannot cross that bridge without having built the solid foundation of Shu first. I needed to question what I learned. I began to perceive the limitations of the method, of the master, and even of my own vices. This phase was simultaneously liberating and frightening because for the first time I was allowed, indeed responsible, to use my own critical mind within the learning process. In the Shu phase, I had committed to following faithfully, to trusting blindly, to absorbing without filtering. But now, having built a solid foundation and incorporated the basic teachings, I was ready for the next essential phase of growth, discernment. I began to notice that the method I had learned worked wonderfully for certain situations, but had limitations in others. I realized that my master, however wise he was, had blind spots based on his own experience and context. And perhaps most importantly, I began to recognize my own addictive patterns, habitual ways of doing things that I had developed in the Shu phase that now needed to be questioned and refined. This questioning wasn't adolescent rebellion or the arrogance of someone who thinks they know better. It was the natural maturation of someone who had done the fundamental work and was now ready for the next level of sophistication. I wasn't rejecting everything I had learned. I was testing the limits, exploring the edges, discovering where the teachings applied perfectly and where they needed adaptation. For example, a technique that worked beautifully under ideal conditions began to show weaknesses in less than ideal situations. A principle that made perfect sense in one context revealed problematic nuances in another. And instead of ignoring these observations for fear of disrespecting my teachers or the method, I now had the maturity to explore these tensions productively, using them as catalysts for deeper understanding rather than as reasons to abandon everything. Questioning is not rebellion. It's the bridge between who I am and who I can be. This distinction was crucial because I had associated questioning with disrespect, doubt with failure, critical thinking with betrayal of teachings. But geishas in the Ha phase were actively encouraged to question, to experiment, to discover their own truths through exploration beyond the initial rules. Their masters weren't offended when they began to adapt techniques. They were proud, because it meant the apprentice had absorbed so much that she was now ready to contribute something new. Questioning from a solid foundation is completely different from questioning out of laziness or ego. Questioning after 1,000 repetitions has a weight and depth that questioning before 10 repetitions will never have. One is evolution, the other is merely resistance to fundamental work. I began asking questions that previously seemed forbidden. Why does it have to be done exactly this way? What happens if I change this variable? Is there a context where a different approach would be more effective? What assumptions are embedded in this method that might not apply to my specific situation? And most importantly, I began questioning my own habits that I had developed. Am I doing it this way because it's actually better or because it's more comfortable? Am I avoiding a certain approach for valid reasons or because it's more difficult? What personal biases am I bringing to this practice that might be limiting my growth? This level of self-questioning was impossible in the Shu phase because I didn't yet have enough experience to distinguish between productive and destructive resistance. But now, with a solid foundation, I could begin to carve my own unique path within the framework I had learned. The most extraordinary geishas were those who deeply honored tradition but were not imprisoned by it. They had spent years absorbing classical teachings in the Shu phase, then years questioning and adapting them in the Ha phase, and eventually emerged with something that was simultaneously faithful to the essence of tradition and completely original in expression. They understood that questioning was not about destroying what came before, but about building on the shoulders of giants instead of just standing on those shoulders forever. I realized that my growth had stagnated in other areas of life precisely because I had jumped directly from not knowing to questioning everything, without ever going through the crucial phase of complete submission to the learning process. Or conversely, in some areas I had become permanently stuck in Shu, blindly following rules years after I should have started questioning and adapting them. Ha was the phase that demanded perfect timing, neither before having a solid foundation, nor so late that you become too rigid to evolve. It was a delicate moment where you had absorbed enough to gain perspective, but were still flexible enough to reshape your patterns into something more refined, more authentic, more aligned with who you were becoming, rather than simply who your mentors were. Laugh, creating my own path. In Ri, I stopped copying. I started creating. This transition was the most subtle and profound of all the Shuhari phases. There wasn't a dramatic moment where I woke up and thought, now I'm in Ri. It was more like crossing an invisible membrane without realizing it, and only when I looked back did I realize I had crossed into completely new territory. In Shu, I faithfully copied every movement, every technique, every detail. In Ha, I questioned, adapted, explored variations within the structure. But in Ri, something fundamentally different was happening. I was no longer mentally consulting the original rules or the adaptations I had made. I was simply flowing, creating in real time, responding intuitively to each unique situation without needing conscious reference to any learned system. The knowledge had integrated so deeply that I was no longer someone applying techniques. I was the very living expression of the principles I had internalized. Ri is the stage of true mastery where you transcend the system you learned, not by abandoning it, but by absorbing it so completely that it becomes invisible, like bone structure under the skin. Master geishas at this stage moved with a naturalness that seemed spontaneous, but was actually the result of decades of structured practice that had become so integrated that it no longer needed conscious structure. They didn't think, now I'm going to do the traditional fan gesture. They simply did it, and the gesture emerged perfectly because it had been repeated 10,000 times until the body knew better than the mind. I began to experience this in small moments, situations where I acted masterfully without planning, where the right response simply flowed from me as if I always knew. where I surprised myself with my own ability that seemed to emerge from nowhere, but was actually the fruit of all the invisible work of the previous stages. When knowledge already lives within me, I no longer follow footsteps. I leave footprints. This phrase perfectly captures the essence of Ri. In Shu, I followed footprints left by masters before me, placing my feet exactly where they had placed theirs. In Ha, I began to stray from the established path, exploring side trails while keeping the main path in sight. But in Ri, I was walking through virgin territory, leaving my own footprints for others to follow if they chose. Not because I had become better than my masters, or because the original teachings were inadequate, but because I had so completely absorbed the essence of those teachings that I could now express the same truth through my unique voice, my unique experience, my unique body and spirit. I was not contradicting what I had learned. I was expanding. I was contributing my own expression to the living tradition that shaped me. The most beautiful thing about Ri is that you finally stop asking yourself, am I doing this right? Because right and wrong at this stage have transcended fixed rules and become about aligning with fundamental principles that now live so deeply within you that they are inseparable from who you are. Master Geishas didn't consult mental manuals about proper etiquette. They were etiquette embodied. They didn't memorize dance movements. They were the dance. And this isn't arrogance or ego. It's the natural result of total dedication through all three stages. I began to realize that in areas where I had truly done the complete work, where I had humbly passed through Shu, courageously through Ha, and patiently emerged into Ri, I operated with a fluidity and confidence that didn't come from thinking I was special, but from knowing that I had done the 10,000 hours, the 10,000 repetitions, the years of refined questioning that brought me to this point of natural mastery. In Ri, you finally become a master, not because you've mastered an external system, but because the system has become you. There is no longer a separation between the practitioner and the practice. You are no longer making the art, you are the art. And paradoxically, it is in this phase of greatest mastery that you feel most like a beginner again, but in a completely different way. It's not the uncomfortable ignorance of Shu, it's the profound humility of recognizing that even after years of practice, there are still infinite depths to explore, still subtle nuances to discover, still ways to refine and evolve. The oldest geishas, those truly in Ri, were the most dedicated to continuous practice, not because they needed to, but because they loved it. They had transcended need and obligation and reached the territory of pure love for the art. And that's when I understood that Ri is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of the true journey, where you finally have total freedom to create, explore, and contribute your unique verse to the eternal poem of the tradition that shaped you, the silent rhythm of dedication. I realized that learning isn't about speed, but consistency. This simple truth completely destroyed my toxic obsession with quick results and instant transformation. I had lived in a sprint mentality when I should have been in a marathon, always looking for hacks, shortcuts, ways to accelerate the natural growth process. I wanted to learn in 3 months what took 3 years. I expected to master in 6 sessions what required 6,000 repetitions. And then I would get intensely frustrated when I didn't see immediate dramatic progress, abandoning practices that could have transformed me if I had just continued longer. The geishas taught me something radically different, that silent, consistent, drama-free dedication is infinitely more powerful than occasional bursts of intense effort followed by abandonment. They practiced every day, not because they felt like it, not because they saw measurable progress in each session, but because they had made a commitment to the sustainable pace of cumulative growth. Modern culture has taught me to value speed above all else. Courses promising language fluency in 30 days, programs promising body transformation in 6 weeks, systems promising mastery of any skill through secret tricks and techniques. And I fell into this trap repeatedly, always seeking the fast track, always disappointed when I discovered that there is no real substitute for time invested in dedicated practice. But geishas operated on a completely different timescale. They thought in years and decades, not weeks and months. A Mineko knew it would take at least 5 years of intense daily training before she became a full-fledged geiko. And even then, she didn't consider her learning finished. She considered it only beginning. This long-term perspective completely removed the anxiety of rapid progress and replaced it with the peace of knowing that if she just kept showing, growth was inevitable. If I advance 1 millimeter a day, in a year, I'll be unrecognizable. When I finally internalized this simple yet profound math, everything changed. A millimeter is invisible. If someone took a picture of you today and tomorrow after 1 millimeter of progress, no one would see any difference. And that's exactly why most people give up. They don't see visible change in the first days, weeks, even months, so they assume they're not progressing and abandon the process. But 1 millimeter a day means 365 millimeters in a year, 36.5 centimeters of movement in one direction, and 36.5 centimeters is absolutely transformative, depending on the context. In a year of daily practice, even if each session seems to make no individual difference, the accumulation is dramatic, revolutionary, totally capable of making you unrecognizable from the person who started. I began applying this principle radically to everything. Instead of sporadic 3-hour sessions when I felt motivated, I started doing 15 minutes every day without exception. Instead of waiting for the perfect time to sit down and work for hours on a project, started doing a single small action daily. Instead of planning dramatic transformations that never materialized, I started making sustainable micro-adjustments that I knew I could maintain indefinitely. And something magical happened. The progress that had previously completely eluded me began to appear. Not because I was putting in more overall effort. In fact, I was doing less in terms of the duration of each session, but because the daily consistency created momentum that sporadic sessions never did. It was like the difference between pushing a giant rock once a week versus pushing it a little bit every day. In the first case, it never moves. In the second, eventually it starts to roll. Geishas understood that sustainable rhythm wins over unsustainable intensity every time. They didn't do 12-hour practice sessions followed by a week of rest. They did a few hours of focused practice daily for years on end, without fail, without drama, without relying on fluctuating motivation. This silent dedication, without the need for external recognition or validation, without the need for constant visible progress, just deep trust in the cumulative process, that was the true secret of their mastery. And I realized I had wasted years in cycles of intense enthusiasm, followed by burnout and abandonment, when I could have been progressing consistently if I had only embraced the slower but infinitely more sustainable rhythm. The humble, silent, unglamorous constancy of simply showing up every day and doing the work, regardless of how you feel, regardless of whether anyone is watching, regardless of whether you see progress today. That is the discipline that separates masters from eternal beginners. And finally, I stopped chasing speed and began to honor the silent rhythm of true dedication. The spirit of Mineko Iwasaki, leveza and mastery. Mineko used to say that art is not born from force, but from lightness. When I discovered the writings of Mineko Iwasaki, one of the most celebrated geishas of modern Japan, who became the youngest geiko of her time and eventually wrote her memoirs, one of her phrases struck me like lightning. The more you try to force perfection, the further away it gets. Mineko had reached levels of mastery that most geishas would never achieve. But what set her apart was not brute force or violent determination. It was lightness. It was the ability to execute the most complex movements with an apparent ease that made it seem like she was playing, not working. And this was not magical natural talent. It was the result of so much training that the effort had become invisible, so much practice that the difficulty had dissolved into natural fluidity. She taught me that true mastery is not about making difficult things seem difficult. It's about making difficult things seem effortless. I had operated under a completely opposite philosophy for years. I thought growth needed to be painful, that if you weren't suffering, you weren't progressing. That visible effort was a sign of dedication. I prided myself on how much I was struggling, how much I was pushing myself, how much I was sacrificing. But Mineko showed that this brute force approach has a low ceiling. You can progress to a certain point through muscular effort and rigid willpower. But true mastery requires you to let go, to allow, to flow instead of forcing. Mineko's most memorable performances weren't those where she was clearly pushing herself to the limit, but those where she seemed to simply be herself in motion. where the boundary between the dancer and the dance had completely disappeared. And this was only possible because she had done so much fundamental work that she no longer needed to force. She could trust. The less I try to impress, the more I learn. This realization turned my motivation upside down. For how long had I been practicing things not to genuinely improve, but to impress others? How much of my energy was being wasted on performance instead of real learning? When my goal is to impress, half my attention is always focused outward. What are they thinking? Do I look good? Are they impressed? But when I completely let go of this need for external validation, when I stopped caring whether someone was watching or impressed, all my energy became available for learning itself. And paradoxically, it was when I stopped trying to impress that I started to truly impress, because I was finally developing genuine skill, instead of just the appearance of skill. The less I try to prove myself, the more I evolve. This was connected but even deeper. It wasn't just about impressing others, it was about proving something to myself. Proving that I was good enough, talented enough, disciplined enough. But the constant need to prove my worth created rigid tension in everything I did. Mineko operated from a completely different place. She had nothing to prove, not because she was arrogant, but because she had internalized her value so deeply that she didn't need external or internal validation through performance. She practiced because she loved the art, not because she needed to prove she was good at it. And this freedom from the need to prove allowed experimentation, allowed failure, allowed growth in ways that are never possible when you are constantly trying to demonstrate existing competence instead of developing new competence. And when I finally stopped competing, I began to flourish. That was the last and most liberating lesson from Mineko's spirit. Competition had been my fuel for so long. Competition with others, constant comparison, perpetual measuring of where I stood in the invisible ranking. But competition creates tension, creates fear, creates a need to protect territory instead of expanding possibilities. Mineko became the best not by fiercely competing with other geishas, but by dedicating herself so completely to her own journey of mastery that competition became irrelevant. She was playing a completely different game. Not how do I compare to others, but how can I most fully express the essence of this art through my unique being? When I finally let go of competition and comparison, when I stopped measuring my progress against other people and started measuring it only against who I was yesterday, something blossomed within me that had been stifled for years. Genuine creativity, joy in practice, organic growth that didn't depend on being better than anyone else, only on being more completely myself. If this journey through Shuhari has touched something deep within you, if you've recognized that you've been skipping essential phases or forcing things when you should be flowing, then you can't stop here. Subscribe to this channel now because this series is just beginning. In the next videos, I'll show you how to apply each phase of Shuhari to specific areas of your life: relationships, career, creativity, health. Turn on notifications because the next video will reveal the most common mistakes that cause people to get stuck in Shu for years when they could be evolving into Ha. Leave a comment telling me, which stage of Shuhari do you recognize yourself in right now? Are you still in Shu, needing to embrace the humility of a beginner? Are you in Ha, questioning and adapting? Or do you feel you've touched moments of Ri, where everything flows naturally? I want to learn about your journey because every story teaches us something. If this video resonated with you, share this with someone who is struggling to learn something new, someone who is trying to force quick results, someone who needs to hear about the power of quiet dedication and lightness in mastery.